There's no God.
There is no God.
There's no evidence for that. I don't see any reason to believe that.
And welcome back, guys. So, as you saw in those videos, most of atheists love to ask the question, why is there no evidence of God? Show me God. Prove to me that God exists. And today I'm here to do exactly that. So, most of the time, when they ask for evidence, what evidence do they exactly mean? Do they mean empirical evidence, evidence that you can hear, smell, touch, see? Well, I'm going to burst your bubble. That type of evidence does not exist for God. And before you start laughing and saying, wow, let me answer why. Empirical evidence is that of material things or natural things. God, by definition, is an immaterial thing or supernatural thing. Therefore, material evidence of an immaterial thing does not exist. You are literally setting me up for failure. So let's leave that aside. What other evidence do we have? Well, we also have rational evidence, which are based upon arguments, logical arguments that you can reduce to find out things and how they work, even if you don't have empirical evidence. And we are going to dive into one of those arguments known as the contingency argument. Now, before we start off with the argument, let's define some basic definitions so you don't get confused. I'll use the word being in this argument, and that word will only imply something. The word being does not imply a will or a mind or something with consciousness. It's just a something. This is a being. Alright? Another word that I'll use in this argument is contingent. Contingent means a thing that can exist otherwise in another possible world. I'll explain that as I move through. And the second requirement of a contingent thing is that it requires an explanation other than itself for its existence. And now the third definition that we are going to define is necessary thing or necessary being. A necessary being is something that is the opposite of contingent. It cannot exist in any other possible ways in all the possible worlds, and it does not require an external explanation to itself. So hopefully you have gone through these definitions. If you haven't, I think you probably understand as I move through this video. Alright, so let's start with the premises. Premise number one, contingent things exist. And if you want an example of a contingent thing, this pen right here. This is an example of contingent thing. This pen is of color blue. Now, can you imagine this pen can be colored red or green or any other color except in blue in any possible world? Of course you can imagine that. The color of this pen is dependent upon the manufacturer of the company. Hence, it meets the two criteria. One, it can exist otherwise in another possible world. Two, it requires an explanation out of itself for its existence. Now, this is the first premise. Contingent things exist. The second premise is that universe is made up of contingent beings. And if we make a set of all the contingent beings in that universe, the set in itself would be contingent. Let me explain why. So imagine if there is an imaginary box over here, and this box is basically the set of all the contingent things. Now in that box, this pen would also be present since it's a contingent being. Now, can it change its color from blue to green? Of course it can. Hence, that box will also be contingent as a whole, as it can exist in another possible way in another world. Now, what is the conclusion that necessarily follows premise 1 and premise 2? The conclusion that necessarily follows is that as all the contingent beings is in that set, and there's no contingent being outside of that set, hence that self itself requires an explanation for its existence, and that explanation cannot be given by a contingent being because all the contingent beings are already in the set. Hence, you require a necessary being that gives explanation to that set's existence. And a necessary being, as I explained, is something that does not have an external explanation to itself, and that cannot exist any other way in any other possible world. That is the contingency-I argument. At this point, that necessary being is not a being with consciousness, with will, with power, nothing, none whatsoever. It's basically a necessary being that forms the foundation of all our contingent universe. And let's move on to the second part of the argument, which is the hard part, and where you might strawman or misunderstand my position. So hear me out clearly. That necessary being must have all the logically possible attributes. If it cannot have all the logically possible attributes, it makes itself a contingent being. And we defined the definitions at the very start of the argument. So, for it to be necessary, it is necessary that it has all the logically possible attributes. Now, what that entails is the following. I'll ask you 4 to 5 simple questions. Is it logically possible for something to have power? Of course it is logically possible. Hence, that necessary being, it must have power. Is it logically possible for something to have mind? Yes, it is logically possible for something to have mind. Is it logically possible for something to have knowledge? Yes, it is logically possible for something to have knowledge. Is it logically possible for something to have will? Yes, it is logically possible for something to have will. Now, all of these logically possible things, the necessary thing must possess all of them to be necessary. And not even a single amount of them, it must have all of them to their utmost potential. Because if it does not have, let's take the attribute of knowledge. If it has less or more knowledge, you can argue that this thing can have more knowledge in another possible world, making it contingent. So, by the definition of necessary being, it must have the highest utmost potential of knowledge. It must have the omni properties basically. So if that something has omniscience, omnipotence, has attribute of mind, will, well, most of the theists regard that as God. And I welcome you to general theism. Now you can ask the question, why does that necessary being have to be only one? Why can't there be more than one necessary beings? But I'd like you to recall the definition of necessary being. A necessary being is not something that can exist otherwise. If there are two necessary beings, then both of these beings, to differentiate both of these beings, one must have an attribute that the other does not. And according to parallel word semantics, both of these things can exist in another possible way with these attributes. Hence, both of these would make themselves contingent, not necessary. So for necessary being to exist, there must only have to be one. And that brings us to monotheistic beliefs. Which monotheistic belief is that? Christianity, Judaism, or Islam? There are many contenders, but those arguments can be discussed further up. For now, I'd like to leave you at this point. And if there is a logical contention with this or what I have said, please let me note down in the comment below and I'll clarify it for you. And with that, I'll take my leave. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.